There was one point I wanted to make at the very end of the last handout before we start the one on censorship. So that would be page 5 of that, yeah. Where Rousseau is talking about taxes. Just an interesting statement that he makes that you have to kind of draw the spirit of his comments out of it. So this is on page 459. And I'll just read this and see what you think he means by this. He says, on the other hand, not all governments are of the same nature. They are more or less voracious. And the differences are found on this added principle that the greater the distance the public contributions are from their source, the more onerous or burdensome they are. It is not on the basis of the amount of taxes that this burden is to be measured, but on the basis of the path they have to travel in order to return to the hands from which they came. When this circulation is prompt and well established, it is unimportant whether one pays little or a great deal of taxes. The populace is always rich and the finances are always in good shape. On the contrary, however little the populace gives, when this small amount does not return, it is soon wiped out by continual giving. The state is never rich and the populace is always destitute. What does he mean by this? What is the difference between it? So it doesn't matter whether you pay a lot of taxes or little, it's how far the distance is between you and the receiver and coming back to you.
Like infrastructure, right? Like if I pay a cent in taxes, but it takes like 2 seconds for me to get a new road when mine breaks, great. But if I pay like $10 in taxes and maybe I have the nicest roads in the world, but it's like 10 years down the road.
That's something of it, yes. That the speed with which it gets spent, or the extent and the speed to which it gets spent in your area for the common good, the better. But the problem is, when people pay taxes, if they are in a country, and this is another knock against larger countries, where there's more layers of administration, then it's going to take a long time to get up to the top where somebody makes a decision about how it's spent, and a lot of it's gone, actually, because it gets sucked up along the way by administration, and then it takes a while for it to get back. Here we have an example of this that I just know about from doing business at K-State. If you cannot pay for something with a credit card or through direct bank transfer, and you have to have a check cut, it will take several days, and more importantly, it costs an inordinate amount of money in labor spent, because it has to be cut in Topeka somewhere and gets sent back here physically. So 2 or 3 people in Topeka have to do something in order to make the check cut. Literally, if you're going to pay, let's say that I seek reimbursement for $25 worth of equipment that I had to buy for the conference or something like that, I could literally have the state spend about the same amount just to cut me the check. Okay? So that means that the actual taxes have not been spent well. It's been a wasteful expenditure. Also, it takes much more time to get to me, so I don't have that money in the meantime to go out and spend. Okay? So yeah, this is a fairly practical statement that I just wanted to point out in the midst of sometimes impractical statements by Rousseau, that he does understand. And part of the problem with understanding these things, though, is his language. That he insists on using highly theoretical language, whereas somebody like Machiavelli made somewhat similar point, just said, if you don't spend much money, you don't need that many taxes, and when you do spend money, it should be something that everybody needs, more or less, and this will keep more money in the hands of the people. That's what you want, because eventually that will prosper everybody more. Yeah. But he says it very directly. Rousseau was trying to build a system based on consistent language. I've got to give him credit for that. So.
But what's the function? Because if we're thinking philosophically, like Plato said, if you can't just tell it to me, you don't really understand it.
Right.
So Machiavelli can just like say it to us straight.
Mhm.
Rousseau's kind of like,
Why? I don't, I mean, I'd like to be able to give you a totally certain answer on this, but I can't do that. I can say that he wants people to think about government in a different way, and maybe he thinks that new language is necessary to make that happen. So by using the term sovereign the way he does and government the way he does, he's trying to get us to conceptualize differently here. And notice he says public contributions. If the word was taxes in French, they would have used that word in the translation. So I'm sure he said public contributions, probably pretty much word for word. And I think he uses it because that's the way he wants us to see this. It's taxes sounds like here comes, the tax man again is going to take more of what's mine. Whereas the more ideally we exist in this system, the more we should see what we give as contribution to the greater good. So, I mean, this is my defense of but I agree with you that, I mean, it's always better to communicate simply in my view. And I agree with Plato, and I think a lot of modern political philosophers went off in this direction. I mean, many are far worse than Rousseau, really. Hegel, notorious for creating his own language, basically. Whereas Plato could express all sorts of complex ideas in language that was everyday language that people could understand, using analogies and comparisons, and that every ordinary person could understand. Not everybody could follow everything he said, obviously, but at least he didn't bar the door at the beginning with a lot of what you might call jargon. So I think this has to be justified, and I haven't seen any defenses of Rousseau's choice of words. That doesn't mean they don't exist, though. So let's look at this next handout on censorship. I guess this would be another example of a term that in a common sense way meant one thing, but Rousseau means another. So here we go. Even in Rousseau's day, people used the term censorship. During the Enlightenment, censorship literally meant the government telling people what they couldn't say and what they couldn't write, before or after the fact, but definitely before. And there were many laws on the books to try to regulate what could be said. And this was deeply resented and was being chipped away at by intellectuals of the day, right? Rousseau is hearkening back to the ancient Roman censorship, which is where the term comes from, but it was an institution. The censors in the Roman Republic were there to monitor the behavior of the politicians. And they had the right to come out in public, in the assembly, in the Senate, for instance, and condemn if they had evidence of immoral or unwise actions on the part of these political leaders, okay? So they could ruin them. Rousseau takes that idea, that's closer to what he's talking about. He's not talking about, prior restraint of speech, okay? He's really talking about something quite a bit stronger than that, which is the development of a system whereby people think, maybe I shouldn't say that, or maybe I shouldn't do that because other people are watching and they will have the right to call me out. Now, I mean, that sounds kind of terrible, but it is a social mechanism that we use all the time, actually. Even now in our country, our free and wonderful country, if a merchant is totally dishonest, what happens to him now?
They get called out, boycotted.
Yeah.
Bad reviews on Yelp.
Right. People put it on Facebook, Twitter, they take a picture of it, and they let people know. Same thing with politicians, right? If a politician's doing something bad, they're even more likely to be caught by fire now than they ever were back then. And it's going to be very public. And the ordinary person does it in that case, in a lot of cases, this is how, poor Anthony Weiner got caught with all of his shenanigans. This when he was stupid enough to put his pictures around or send his pictures to other people who decided that some of them didn't like this.
I forgot about that.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
He was really stupid.
Yeah.
But stupidity has a way of popping up in all sorts of unusual places. And of course, once that picture's out there, other people can say, hey, that's inappropriate. And out it goes to the public, okay? And this type of behavior is very human. In small towns in the past, we didn't need to have Facebook and Twitter. All we needed to have was the gossip machine. People would quickly talk about, and sometimes this, and same thing now, this can be very harmful too if it's misplaced, right? People can be hurt when their actions are misunderstood, or when something really ought to be private that somebody pries into that's not a matter of stupidity, but somebody actually going after somebody else, right? And so it can cause a lot of harm, but it also serves this function of kind of putting people on notice. You're a member of a community, and you're not totally free to do whatever you want. Not everything is private, right? And yes, you're being watched.
So who does he say the censors are exactly?
The censors would be not in his system the whole general public, but more like the Roman system where certain people are appointed the role of watching.
It doesn't sound too bad. I mean, if you think about it, it's like we have watchdog agencies. These guys can just go on the floors of Congress and say, "Hey, by the way, you're kind of inappropriate." Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds worse than it is when you really think about it. We do have a lot of those functions, though, as you say, watchdog agencies, the media. Nonprofits of all kinds that keep their eye on things, and they serve this purpose, and we're grateful for it in a lot of cases because otherwise we wouldn't know.
I guess my critique would be what happens when, would Rousseau believe it'd be possible for the censor to become corrupt?
Yeah, and I think that is a danger there, right? And that's where the purely liberal mind leaps to. How can this be abused?
Yeah.
Now Rousseau would advocate for changing up all of these positions, right? So that you wouldn't be in any position for life, and that would hopefully help the situation. But we know that corruption can happen even if somebody holds a position for just a while. And they can be bribed, they can use their position for personal reasons and so forth. So again, whenever Rousseau talks about things like this, it's an ideal. It's a proposal that would work. If everything works the way it's supposed to, it will work well. If not, it will work less well, okay? But as I say here, his censorship is really more about making sure that the leaders, so to speak, whoever they may be, depending on the type of government we're talking about, that their law is actually, the laws that they pass actually conform to the general will, that their actions also conform to the general will, which is the common good, okay? So they would have to have a very good knowledge of the general will. And what he's talking about is what I would call moral suasion, which is shaming, criticizing, putting pressure to bear in this way, not necessarily, hauling you off to jail. But if this was done well, it would provide a lot of social pressure. He says down at the bottom of 481, the censorship maintains mores by preventing opinions from becoming corrupt. Okay, so the censorship, because it exists, becomes self-censorship. That's how it works. If it was just constant enforcement, it wouldn't, you know. But just like with the law generally, most people ask themselves, is what I'm about to do going to get me into trouble? Okay, so he says, by preserving their rectitude through wise applications, and sometimes even by making a determination on them when they are still uncertain, so they can also speak about, you know, what is proper and what is not. The use of seconds in duels, this is an example. Does everybody know what seconds are in duels? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So, you know, as a matter of fact, Andrea Mansker talked about this when she was talking about women dueling. And she said because women in the Enlightenment, some female figures decided they were going to try their hand at dueling, either against women or even against men. And one of her examples was this woman who had challenged a man to a duel because he had defamed her character and her speaking ability in his newspaper, and he had even admitted that he probably just made it up. So she challenged him to a duel, and he wouldn't do it. He said something to the effect of, well, if you get a second who is capable, i.e. male, of, you know, dueling with me, then I might rethink this, you know. Or maybe your brother or your father or somebody like that. So in that case, it is a very unusual case. I don't think that it would be cowardice necessarily to call upon a second, but can you see why in a lot of cases people might think it cowardly to call upon a second? Okay. It's basically saying, I'm not capable, or I'm too frightened to face you, so I'll pick my bigger, badder brother, you know, to do it, or my buddy. Okay, so the use of seconds in duels, which had been carried to the point of being a craze in the Kingdom of France, no surprise there, was abolished by the following few words of the king's edict: as for those who are cowardly enough to call upon seconds. So once the king used that phrase, that practice came to an end. Okay? So he didn't need to punish anybody or create this, you know, firm law. All he had to do was influence popular opinion by this, because he's the tone setter in that case. So he served the function of the censorship there. This judgment, he says, anticipated by that of the public and suddenly made a determination. It anticipated that of the public and suddenly made a determination. But when the same edicts tried to declare that it was also an act of cowardice to fight duels, which of course is quite true but contrary to common opinion, the public mocked this decision. It concerned a matter about which its mind was already made up. Okay? So you see there the connection between true public opinion and what the censor says. Okay? In the first case, it worked because even though it was a craze, probably because of cowardice, you know, people were doing it, but as soon as the king said what everybody really thought, then it could legitimately come to an end. But when he went on to say something was cowardice that most people thought was courageous, it didn't have any effect. Okay? He would have had to have passed a law against it. And they did start passing laws against dueling. But it still didn't have any effect. People continued to duel for quite some time, all the way through the 19th century. So, you know, this issue of what is courageous and what is cowardly, that's a great way to influence people, but only if that public opinion is already pretty close to being there. Okay? That puts it back on the sovereign sort of common consensus, see? So in that way, the censor is not as, again, Rousseau wouldn't see the censorship as tyrannical. However, some interpreters of Rousseau still don't like it and still see it as too tyrannical. And they point out, as Brett did, in practice it could easily become corrupted and not follow the spirit of what Rousseau says here. Then it becomes, you know, possibly tyrannical.
Because that's a lot of power to hold.
It is.
I feel
Being
like
a censor.
something like that, like it would be really hard. I guess in Rousseau's ideal, you know, political body, you wouldn't have a large country like ours and people would be more similar. But like
Mhm.
today, censors would probably be very, very controversial because there are so many different, opinions on every little thing.
Yeah.
That, which one is going to be the popular opinion, especially when on larger issues, there's like half and half divide between the two.
Mhm.
So, almost half your country would be unsatisfied with whatever the censors
Definitely.
decided to, censor basically.
Yeah. So, I mean, the examples that we talked about before in our country were all, or most of them would be, there are some government watchdog agencies, obviously, and regulatory agencies, but they deal with very specific things that have already been passed by law, right? So they look at, does government or private business conform to the law, which we've already passed. A lot of the other watchdog agencies and private groups, they're definitely private, and they do vary. Like the Anti-Defamation League, they look at, especially anti-Semitism and what that, how that's being expressed in various countries and what people are or not doing about it. It's very specific, okay? The Urban League, similar, African Americans, right? Or the NAACP. We don't have a government body or people appointed by the government that set the tone more generally or are capable of looking into everything. The Senate could, the Seneth could do it, I guess. They could. Yes, you're right.
In here at K-State or like the U.S. Senate.
The U.S. Senate.
Are you thinking like baseball, for instance? Sometimes they meddle in baseball and things like that. That always just blows my mind.
Yeah.
They get involved in American baseball.
Yeah, they do. I think they got involved in that huge scandal with the what's his face? It was the Genesis or whatever it was that did the steroid thing.
Oh, right. Yes. What's his name? Yeah. Which is, now why is the Senate involved in that?
I don't know.
I wish I could remember the guy's name, but you're right. So,
Yeah, I can't remember his name. I should know that.
and I've always,
Bill Clinton came up for his philandering
Mhm.
charges. He was in front of the Senate.
right. Although the question wasn't the question.
Oh, whether he lied.
No, that was the question before the court. You're right. When he came up before the Senate, I think it was on the table. Just the judgment factor,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
I don't really know if we necessarily have per se. I don't know.
I should ask Dr. Franke because I'm not actually sure, but you're absolutely right that sometimes the Senate gets involved. It can decide to hold hearings
We
on
have a
anything.
committee. Yeah, we have a committee that's called something else rather than I can't remember what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Here at K-State? Or
No,
government?
like in the government. I can't remember what
I'm
it
going to
is.
ask him. Yeah, because they can hold hearings on anything.
Yeah.
Hearings
we
are a
can.
great way of doing this too, because they may not, they don't have to issue some sort of ruling or propose some sort of bill, but they get whatever the issue is out there in front of the whole world to see,
Oh
right?
yeah.
So-
Oh yeah. It's a good example. Like a good example of that is they can literally do it on anything. During the communist movement, anybody they think that was a communist, they'd subpoena
right.
you and you'd come forward and
Mhm.
you'd have to talk against them, and they would already criminalize you.
And
just
you'd
for
be
you
in
to
the
thought of.
media,
Yep, and then you'd
your
be
reputation
in
is
front-
tarnished.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So they can hold a committee on anything.
So, and they do sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
So there's
like
our
the baseball
censorship.
thing, for example.
Yeah.
For example.
That always catches my attention, and I always stop and ask myself, why is the Senate involved in American baseball?
Sports, just
Sports,
in general.
yeah.
I didn't get that.
That is big. I suppose it's considered an American institution
Yeah, but-
almost, but
But still, I think that the specific like the Major League Baseball
Mhm.
organization or the National Football League should take care of it, not them.
no, it's
We don't
private.
have a U.S. Department of Athletics.
No.
No, we
Exactly.
don't. No, we don't. We don't have. We have laws maybe against illegal drug use, but actually steroid use, to use that example, is not illegal. It's just
frowned upon.
it's against
And it's
MLB's.
against MLB
Yeah, but not.
standards.
We go and get steroid shots when we have a backache or whatever, so there's nothing particularly wrong about this, but sports set their rules, and why is the Senate involved in that? So because some senator thinks that it's so critically important that this institution stay pure and unsullied that he's willing to hold hearings, and he's all powerful and he can hold them. So I'll ask Frankie if there's any sort of rules about what they can and cannot bring before the Senate. You don't see it all the time, and I think when it happens, people don't necessarily understand exactly what's happening, you know. Are they going to, because normally you would think if they hold a series of hearings, they're going to try to propose some sort of legislation, but that's not what happens in these cases. So the Red Scare is a great example.
That was a good example. No, steroids are great. That's what I took for when I had mono. I just thought about that. Like, they work like a dream. They do.
Well, I mean,
whenever I had mono, I took them, and
my son took them
felt
too.
Wonderful.
There are a lot of people that have to take them either for allergies or when they're like small children. If they're born prematurely, they have to take steroids or they're in danger of dying. I mean, it's very common practice to use them actually.
I took prednisone that was last semester during finals. I'm glad that the doctor put me on that. That would have been terrible.
Yeah, prednisone is something you can't stay on for a long time, but it can really help in the short run. And one of these days, anybody who is active but has any sort of joint issues or, back
typically
issues.
Give you shots for that.
They give you shots for that. Eventually, that's going to happen to me because my hip joints I have dysplasia. So right now, I just I'm staying in good shape and I'm trying to do my best. But before I get those hip replacements, they're going to be injecting me with steroids and that's what it takes to keep going. I think they should probably reconsider the rules in sports and just let people use them, because if they did, they use them uniformly, and then everybody would be equal. But
yes, I mean some of the steroids they use in baseball are they're bad for you too.
Well, that guy, whoever, I can't remember his name, but he got so bulked up, his kidneys were probably totally shot. Too many steroids can kill you.
Yeah, they can kill you.
It's like the Hulk Hogan example, like he used steroids and it would bulk up just one of his arms and the other one it completely shriveled up and destroyed, like the muscle, couldn't use the muscles in it, and that's why he always poses on the one side, not the other side.
Poor guy. So if it was made legal, then it could be regulated, and you could make sure people didn't abuse it like that. But that's for the Senate to decide.
I guess so.
Apparently. Okay, so just to sum up here, what we've gotten so far, we can say that Rousseau is giving us a standard by which to judge. Okay, this is one way of looking at it anyway, that Rousseau is somewhat of an idealist, and he gives us a standard by which to judge politics and society. And these are some of his standards, okay? And perhaps this helps us to understand why he went through the 3 different forms of government and even mixed government as possibilities. And he uses this example of the king's edict as an example of censorship, because he knows that there's going to be a variety of types of government, but any government can come closer or farther away from these ideals. So ideally, the general will of the people should prevail over the individual selfish will. Okay, and we're going to look at this even more, how that general will is formulated and expressed. Social unity should be encouraged instead of faction. So this is the Jefferson versus the Madison. Okay. Simplicity of lifestyle should be encouraged, and luxury and waste should be discouraged. And it was one of his biggest criticisms of his own society, as you know, was the wealthy people were wallowing in luxury and wasting resources.
I feel like he could talk about that for years.
Yeah, he could. It angered him greatly, and he really didn't. He did go to their parties and talk to them, and he was supported by them to a certain extent, but he didn't live this way.
I feel like when he's at those parties, he just had a smug look about him.
Yeah.
Just shaking his head the entire time.
Right. Not happy about it. And he went and he criticized them to their face, and they liked it, which is how perverse they were, It was just fashionable to to be castigated for
Strange
whatever.
times back then.
There was a trend amongst the French elite to make their, you know how they had those ornate gardens with the shrubs all carved up and everything, to turn those gardens back into natural spaces, to let them grow up and to not trim everything as a response to Rousseau's naturalism, you know.
They missed the point there.
What was
I
that?
think they missed the point there.
They missed the point? What would the point be?
It's not your shrubs, it's you.
Right, exactly. The shrubs being an expression of their something flashed into my mind. You know those people in the Hunger Games, the Capitol people?
Yeah.
With their
Yeah.
fancy hair and all the colors and the makeup. And
That's exactly what I think about when I think of France or just anywhere in
Right.
Europe in this time.
It's the shrubbery on people, right?
Yeah.
Just so into fashion that they've lost their bearings. That's the way that Rousseau saw these people. So, serious morality and religion versus hypocrisy in morality and religion. We're going to get into what Rousseau thought the best civil religion was. And it turns out not to be Christian, which is interesting since he likes Geneva. But like I said before, he likes Geneva because it's a fairly decent example of a small city-state run in a way that produces the simplicity of lifestyle and mores. But there's things about Christianity that are flawed in his view. And he goes kind of radical here in his criticism of it. Ethic of equality, the ethic of equality versus hierarchy, we know about that. So on the left-hand column, these are the ideals, and these are where society should lean towards rather than in the other direction, okay? Okay, so the underlying standard for government we find under this chapter 1 in book 5 on the general will, which he says is indestructible in the sense that it's more of an ethical value than a physical reality. That's why he can say it's indestructible. Okay. A couple of lines down, he says, then all the energies of the state are vigorous and simple, okay, as long as several men together consider themselves to be a single body. Then all the energies of the state are vigorous and simple. Its maxims are clear and luminous. There are no entangled contradictory interests. The common good is clearly apparent everywhere, demanding only good sense in order to be perceived. Peace, union, equality are enemies of political subtleties. Upright and simple men are difficult to deceive on account of their simplicity. Traps and clever pretexts do not fool them. They are not even clever enough to be duped. When among the happiest people in the world, bands of peasants are seen regulating their affairs of state under an oak tree and always acting wisely, can one help scorning the refinements of other nations, which make themselves illustrious and miserable with so much art and mystery? So simple. That's really important. Okay. I don't think we have to go over this. I'd like to move right on into discussion of civil religion. So if you go to the last page of the handout, this is a summary, but then we're going to go back and we're going to look at some things in specific here. But in book 4, this is where he elaborates on the civil religion, which more than the censorship and maybe equal to the founder is the source of unity that he wants in a state. So the minimal beliefs that his civil religion is going to require is first that there is a God, and it has to be an otherworldly God. Okay? So it's not just the king or somebody like that. God demands people to be good and virtuous. So you tie up this simplicity of mores, the honesty that he wants in people. Okay? And then the good that we understand must be the common good, right? So we must think not of our own good, but of the good of all, which requires a lot more thinking, okay? The good person is the good citizen, right? So the citizenship is tied up with moral goodness and with God, okay? So it's all connected, all right? God wants people to be good citizens because we need to think about the common good and act accordingly. Makes sense? All right? Belief that God punishes the wicked in the afterlife. All right? Because that helps people to stay in line. Notice this could be just a lot of religions. Couldn't be all religions, but it could be a lot of religions.
I think it's interesting that he chooses the afterlife, because you think he's starting from scratch and he can do whatever he wants.
Mm-hmm.
It seems more compelling to do God can punish you in the present life.
Yeah.
Kind of like a karma thing.
Through the censors, maybe, or through
Right.
actual government action and so forth. And of course, government's actions and the censorship are tied up with God in the civil religion too. But
even like,
this-
I mean, your child will be sick, or,
Mhm.
more like.
Well, the problem with that, though, is you will find, the problem with that way of thinking when it's stressed is that you will inevitably find that there's a child who gets sick to somebody who's deemed to be extremely upright.
Mm-hmm.
That people will see that there's no necessary connection between this terrible natural occurrence and the person's character. Or the other bad thing that can happen is they don't see it, but they start to suspect that, well, if that bad thing happened to this person, then there must be something wrong with them. And that also can interfere with the trust and the cohesion that he wants. So, I mean, it can be used to motivate really superstitious people, but it doesn't work too well if people are thinking, too much. And of course, everybody wants to think they don't have a moral problem. So if a bad thing happens to them, this is obvious proof that that there's something wrong here, and God's not in charge. But this is the more primitive way of thinking in religion is, if I didn't, if it's not raining, it's because I didn't do the rain dance well enough. There's something wrong with, my belief system or something like that. But this would be why you'd want the prospect of an afterlife. Okay. Intolerance is the one thing that we cannot tolerate.
That's pretty hypocritical.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, when he says intolerance, what exactly does he mean by that? Because he's basically, earlier on, he said, if, you're not, you don't have the same opinions and you don't have the same beliefs as everybody else in the system, they have a right to fix
Yes.
your beliefs. That would be intolerance.
It would in our book, but if it wouldn't in his, because the general will has determined the will of all, and if you're out of step with that, it's because you're basically unethical. You're not. You need to rethink. So
he's saying intolerance to the general will.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean
Is that what he means more by intolerance?
Well, here when he's discussing religion, he's talking about, in particular, religious tolerance. So.
Okay. Oh.
Okay, so there's a variety of religions that can fit this general description. But if you believe that only your particular religion alone can save people, and that everybody else, even if their religion conforms to these standards, is going to hell, and you preach that, then
you're being intolerant.
You're being
Okay.
intolerant. You're
Gotcha.
not accepting other people's beliefs. This is a framework that's general enough. There are some religions that would be excluded because either they don't believe in an afterlife, or maybe they don't believe that God is all good.
Judaism.
Okay.
There's no afterlife.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. So there you go. I mean, it wouldn't provide the function, so it in that case, it wouldn't be tolerated. Surprise! Rousseau does seem contradictory in that, tolerance is not his highest good, because if it was, he would tolerate both. He'd tolerate Judaism, maybe Buddhism. Buddhism is another religion that doesn't really involve the afterlife, as I understand it anyway. It has add-ons. And of course atheism wouldn't be tolerated, because you have to believe in a God. So from our perspective, this is not tolerance, okay? But it's tolerance within what he considers to be a workable system for creating this kind of unanimity. You can't have the level of tolerance that we have and have anything but a lot of different opinions, all of which clash and which separate people. Now, I mean, what he didn't anticipate is one of the effects of liberal tolerance is a decrease in the zeal that people hold, with which they hold their core religious beliefs, to where it will become rarer and rarer to find somebody willing to say only, Catholicism can save people's souls, or only, this brand of Baptist religion can save people's souls, and everybody else is doomed. Okay? We still have folks like that, but they're becoming rare. You don't hear that preached in very many churches, because in our society it's just becoming very unacceptable, right? And it just doesn't go along with our equality, our value of equality and freedom and so forth. And so, not that religion necessarily is becoming unimportant to people, but people are not as zealous in their promotion of it and their particular brand of it as they once were. They really are becoming more, you might say, accepting of many paths to God, more or less. That's an effect of liberalism that takes a while to unfold, and which I'm sure Rousseau couldn't fully see, the development of that.
I guess my question would be, what if the general will does not want his form of religion? Would he be accepting of that? Would he just be like, okay? Well, I mean, like, what if the general will does not want this form that he is designed for them?
It's almost as though Rousseau is saying that the general will, because it's an ethical norm, and it's about the good for all, would not be able to genuinely reject something like this, which is obviously for the good of all. Right, because you're talking about how do we really get the general will? Well, we vote, right? And and then if we vote, then individuals are voting and making up their minds. And in that case, we could definitely do that. We could vote that we don't want to have this civil religion. We don't want any civil religion.
It seems like he just has like very ulterior motive, like Hobbes to me. It seems like with his religion.
Well, yes.
It almost seems
similar.
It almost seems like he's just like catering to the times, almost like, because it was seen as pretty not okay to not believe in some type of religion in that time, like even still. During the Enlightenment period, like there was an increase in the amount of people who were atheists, but it was still seen as inappropriate to not believe in a religion.
Right.
So it almost seems like to have a civil religion, which was commonplace, would be seen as very inappropriate if you didn't at least add something in there about it. And adding it like this makes it acceptable to everybody at that time, because everybody would have been some sort of Christian, or, which surprises me, this would have included Muslim as well.
Yeah. Deists,
Yeah.
who were a big deal at that time. Deism was fashionable amongst the intellectual elite, so
I don't know, I
it
think
would have fit.
the political instrument, is that what you mean by like ulterior motive? I
Yeah,
can see that.
like how he puts it seems that the center of his religion is the good citizen. Like everything branches off of that the good citizen is like the center of his government too.
That's what he's trying to produce, and that's why he
Yeah.
thinks a civic religion is necessary to create that, unity and turning your attention away from your own self and towards the greater good needs the backing of something higher than yourself, right? And something more awesome than human beings. The founder also fills that role partly because he's long gone and he's a mythological figure that you have this awe and respect for. So, all right, so when we come back on Friday, we'll get all over civil religion and see if we can figure it out further.